Welcome to the People, Property, Place podcast with me, your host, Matthew Watts, founder and managing director of Rockborn. This is a podcast where I share the stories, views, opinions and career journeys of the movers, shakers, innovators and leaders in the real estate industry. Welcome to the People, Property, Place podcast. Today we are joined by Tom Larsson, founder of Grow Places, who are a creative and compassionate property developer and development manager. Grow Places build long-term relationships to unlock complex problems as found in the built environment, focused on future trends and design excellence. Tom's worked in real estate since 2009, initially as an architect before moving to Stanhope, where he spent 10 years working on some incredible schemes as a development director and latterly design director. He set Grow Places up in March 23, along with launching his podcast, People, Grow Places, and a foundation called the Grow Foundation. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here.
Is this the first time you've been a guest on a podcast rather than you hosting your own podcast?
This is, yeah, and I'm already very jealous and envious of your amazing intro you've just done there. It's fantastic.
Well, we were just having a bit of a chat off screen or off mic here, just about the various different kit and geeking out about all the setup. So
yeah, exactly.
I'm sure we can continue that conversation off mic. But look, a place that I always like to start these conversations, Tom, is how did you get into real estate and why did you decide to make your career in this space?
Yeah, so for me, I think career decisions have been quite clear for me from a young age, actually. You know, I toyed with ideas when I was much younger of going into the police or doing other things like that. But then actually it was kind of shows like Grand Designs and Location when I was much younger, watching those, having an interest in design, but also an interest in geography. Those two things kind of came together for me. And so from quite a young age, I actually wanted to go into design and architecture, and that led me to study architecture. I then worked for a leading architect in London, as you mentioned. So working on a range of projects, cultural projects such as the Tate extension in St Ives, private houses and mixed use redevelopments and reuse of existing buildings. And although I really loved design and architecture as a passion, I didn't qualify fully as an architect. I didn't go the full way through the journey. And that was through some kind of internal restlessness, I think, from me about kind of not necessarily wanting to follow the linear path. And I became quite interested in some of the questions that go around setting the brief. So as an architect, it's a great profession and you have a lot of influence and a lot of creativity, but you're always responding to a problem that's set by someone else. So put some context around that. So a brief comes into the architect's office, design me a residential development. I found myself going, well, why does the client want it to be a residential development? Why haven't they said it's an office development? Why are they proposing it to be a new build rather than retaining some of these existing structures? So some of those kind of bigger questions about why and how design fits into a wider ecosystem of property and then broader than that into society and into place, I became interested in. And obviously I didn't really know, I couldn't contextualize it quite as well as that at the time, but I found myself kind of wanting to understand the other side of things and some of the other positions in the industry, really.
So rewinding then, have you got family or friends who are within the real estate space, or was it literally just on TV, Grand Designs, location, and just kind of thinking, oh, that's interesting. You know, there's a design aspect that catches my eye, but maybe like a commercial or a financial play there as well.
Yes and no. My parents both worked in the NHS. My dad was a surgeon and then a doctor, and my mum was a nurse. So they met in that very kind of Hollywood moment, I think, across the operating table. And my sister kind of picked up that kind of biological science-based gene, I think, and went into veterinary. But for me, I couldn't think of anything worse than working in a hospital. You know, the amazing work that people do, and it's fantastic. But for me, I've always sort of not enjoyed being in and around hospitals or other things like that. And so it was never really in my mind to go that way. But I think what I have picked up from that is, you know, we'll talk about the foundation and other things. It's this idea of doing something that's about service and being for other people and kind of contributing to society and to things that are greater than yourself. I think I've picked that up from my parents, but more than the actual kind of discipline that I've managed to go into, and, you know, trying to kind of take some of those maybe kind of foundational values about me as a person that I've learned from my family and move that into what I do now is quite an interesting challenge, really.
We've had quite a few people who've been on this podcast whose route into real estate has been through architecture, and they've started down that journey and then they've pivoted. Can you just elaborate on what you need to do to become a qualified architect, and then at what stage you pivoted out and why you pivoted out? I know you touched on that a little bit earlier.
I think,
and then maybe your learnings, having kind of started on a course or like being opened up a little bit more to this world of commercial real estate.
Yeah. So architecture is a great profession. I think it does a lot for society. It does a lot for the industry. But it's an old-fashioned profession in the same way, kind of, doctor, solicitor. And because of that, it's a sort of set route to transition through education. So it's actually potentially going through a reform at the moment, which I think probably could be beneficial, though there's different perspectives on that. But as it stands at the moment, you do an undergraduate, typical undergraduate. Then you tend to go and work in practice for minimum of a year, but a lot of people tend to go a little bit longer than that. Then you go back in for a further 2 years, postgraduate. Then you go back into the world of work again, and you do a final part 3, it's called, which is to get you the full certification under the RIBA, which is another year, but it's in practice. I don't know how much detail we go into, but there are other recognised bodies such as the ARB, and then in Europe and elsewhere they all have their own kind of governing body for the profession, and some of those professions only require you to do part 1 and 2 of that process as opposed to 3 parts and still be classed as a architect under the law, as that kind of protected title. So that's the process that you go through. So it is quite a ladder, to be honest. It's kind of, you're graded in the same way, depending on where you are in the process, and with that comes a hierarchy of kind of the role you have, also the kind of the pay structure you sit in, the responsibility you have. And obviously as you get slightly more senior, people branch out from that and maybe they set up their own business, but generally speaking, there's kind of that route through the profession. And as I said earlier, that didn't really sit quite well with me. I liked, maybe I'm slightly impatient, maybe you could say slightly more kind of self-initiated in how I want to kind of live my life. So I never quite kind of felt maybe that I was a bit of a square peg in a round hole in terms of that professional progression, even though I really enjoyed the aspects of the actual job. So that's kind of the profession. And then that led me on to questioning, as I said, well, what else is maybe out there? And I guess it's different for different people, but I think there's a big thing for young people maybe listening to this is you don't know what you don't know about the industries. So there's a whole world of work. There's a whole range of different jobs, different products and services and ways you can apply yourself within the economy that don't necessarily fit within the defined job titles that people have had historically. And, I sort of felt my way into development. And, I think what architecture gives you is it teaches you how to think, which is really important skill, particularly in the modern world where there's a lot of, automation of manual tasks and an administrative task that's happening. And there's going to be a lot more jobs and other things which are kind of displaced by technology, and the value of what people can bring to industries is slightly shifting. So in that world, actually being a kind of a lateral thinker, a creative thinker, which architecture school gives you, is really, really important and a really valuable trait. So you see lots of people who study architecture go into a range of things. Some obviously continue to be an architect, some go into other aspects of design, some go into client-side roles, some go into policy, some people go work for local government, like via kind of public practice as an entity that's been set up to try and strengthen the public sector. So there's a range of different ways that you can apply your skills, and obviously that's not specific to just architecture, that's specific to anything. So I'd just say to people out there is kind of think about, well, what do you value in yourself? What do you think are your strengths? What are you most interested in? And then try and experiment, particularly if you're in your 20s, use that as a time to experiment and see where you go. But you have to take some risk, and you have to kind of put yourself out there a little bit and feel uncomfortable from time to time. The transition that I made into development from architecture was a year of uncertainty, a year of discomfort for me, because I was going from a profession that, as I said, was very linear and you knew where you were on the ladder, into development, which is, and I'm sure you'll know, like a lot of people in the industry go, well, how do you get into a developer? What skill set does it require? It's not, you don't really see a job necessarily advertised a lot of the time to be in a developer. They're often quite people-light organisations, but have quite a lot of impact within the industry. And so all I can say is from my experience, I spent a year emailing, approaching people, going to meet as many people as I could, saying, can I have a job in a subtle way, almost kind of selling through, not to those people, and just asking for advice. And they go, well, we haven't got anything, but go and talk to Joe Blogs, or you get passed around a little bit. And through that process, I learned a lot about the industry, and I learned, so when my time did come around to actually have a formal opportunity and an opening at Stanhope, I felt ready for it because I'd done that kind of prep over the course of that year.
It's interesting. I think it's underrated. People often think about, I've got to have the technical skills, or I've got to have this particular skill set, round peg, round hole. Whereas I guess what you're kind of like alluding to there is the behaviours that actually, if you've got the behaviours and you've got like the drive and the initiative, and you can make stuff happen, and you can kind of educate yourself and put yourself in a room in the right organisation and environment and setup, that individual will be able to learn the technical elements of the role. And certainly from an employer perspective, high performers typically have the right behaviours and the technical skill set. But you're not going to have that if you're at a junior or you're looking to kind of transition into a new role. So, I think it's a really valid point around the behaviours you need in order to get yourself in a room or give yourself that opportunity, rather than just waiting around thinking that you're going to try and get the skill set out of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that applies to all aspects of life. I'm a big kind of believer in the idea of growth and the growth mindset, and obviously that links to my brand at Grow Places, but even broader than that, just ideas of personal growth. And some of that is quite uncomfortable, and you have to kind of push yourself and put yourself in sometimes slightly uncomfortable positions to grow and learn from that. And I think if I look back over my life, that phase when I was transitioning from architecture to development was a real phase of discomfort, but inevitably a phase of growth as well. I remember talking to my friends at the time who were all like a bit questioning, well, why am I doing this? And I didn't necessarily know the answer myself. I was just sort of trying to feel my way through it. And now I look back, and as I say, I've still got a number of friends in architecture, and I'm very lucky to work with all the amazing architects in London and the UK and slightly further afield. But I now look back on it and I can kind of see, okay, well, kind of glad I went through that bit of the curve to kind of be where I am now.
Talk to me about Stanhope. Who are Stanhope? And talk to me about the kind of the moves that you made when you joined that business.
Yeah. So Stanhope are one of the leading mixed-use intelligent development companies in the UK. They've been operating for over 30 years now, and business has gone through a few transitions in terms of its leadership, but there's some core values and principles that run through that business about trust and treating people fairly and excellence in everything they try to do, and that leading to kind of best-in-class projects, predominantly commercial development, whether that's kind of commercial office or commercially driven residential, but also large master plans and place creation, predominantly in the UK. So, I was very fortunate and grateful to have the opportunity to join that business 10 years ago or so now, and I was comparatively young compared to a lot of the people in that business, and that was a big learning curve for me, and it allowed me to work with some really great people in that business and learn from them, and not only within that business but within the wider network. As a company like Stanhope or a developer generally, you're higher up the kind of pyramid in terms of there's fewer people internally within the organisation, but you have a much bigger network that you're interfacing with. So everyone from, as I say, architects, engineers, planning consultants, agents, and then down into the contractors, the trade contractors, and the supply chain. So it's the role of a developer, I class it as it's a bit of a kind of a jack of all trades role. It's kind of a middleman type role, but both in a really positive sense. You need to know enough about every discipline. You need to know the right people to go to for that advice. But you're in a way the orchestrator of that process.
Sat between the equity, funding it, and then
correct
all the other parts pulling it together and delivering it.
Correct, yeah. So the way that I like to sort of boil that down into kind of like a first principles way of thinking about things is that you've got almost this triangle between opportunities, which is land, projects, property development sites. You've got money, which is typically funds or private wealth. And then you've got a skills network, which is your architects, your consultants, your agents. And a perfect project comes from that triangle. So the money is trying to find the opportunities and then the right skills network to deliver it. Whereas if you're an architect, i.e. in the skills network, you're looking for opportunities and the money to kind of fund it. And the developer kind of sits in the middle of that and acts as as I've said on my website, the kind of the production company for the built environment. That was something which, it was actually during my year that I spent between architecture and development. I went to see an architect developer called Roger Zagolovich, who his company called Solid Space is an architect-led developer. And that's maybe a bit of an insight for people actually about the way I approach things. Well, obviously, my world that I knew at the time was architecture. And I then thought, I'll start with architect developers, i.e. design-led developers. So I went and met as many of them as I could. And then from there, I branched out into, there's developers who come at it from a finance background, there's developers who come at it from an agency background. So you kind of learn the ecosystem as you go. But that was my way in. But back to what Roger said, which has always stuck with me, is that the developer is like the production company for the built environment. So in the same way that if you're producing a movie, you have your director, you have your film crew, you have your location sort of teams. So the production company isn't the director, or in the built environment case, the architect, who's the ultimate creator, but they produce the type of feel for the film that they want by the type of director they choose. So if you go and get Steven Spielberg, or if you go and get Tim Burton, you're going to get a very different feel of film, but you're not the one who's actually created it. So I approach development in the same way. So if I go and get Renzo Piano, or if I go and get AHMM, both excellent architects, and it's nothing to do with their ability to deliver the scheme, but one's going to look and feel very different to the other. So you have that element of curation, that element of production that you can still gives me a feeling of kind of creativity and influence over the look and feel of the developments without being the one who's actually designing it.
Yeah,
I'm not claiming to design them.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. So you joined Stanhope. What was your first role, and then just talk me through your kind of progression and the different opportunities? Because like you said, you're there for a decade, and your role must have evolved and changed, and you must have had more say over which architect to choose and how that design and look and feel and the curation is going to come. But you can't have had that from day one. So can you just run me through like the earlier part, some of the projects you worked on?
Yeah. So I joined as a junior. Stanhope as a business, because the role that a developer has is typically a managerial or directorship role within the process. So it's generally a more experienced individual who is in that role. You don't typically have much entry level roles, although that is changing, and bigger developers are better at that, and to be honest, the industry generally is getting better at kind of the idea of almost like an apprenticeship where you shadow someone. So I was very fortunate to shadow a guy called Ron German, who is I've got the utmost respect for, and he's one of the original guys from Stanhope, still there today. I was fortunate enough to shadow him. So at the time he was the pre-development director, I guess you would call it, but he was effectively running the television centre redevelopment in White City. And at that stage, the project was in pre-planning. So I worked alongside Ron, shadowing him during the early stages of that project. And then it was a really nice evolution, over time with his stewardship, but also with others, relatively quickly over the course of a couple of, years, really. I managed to sort of find my feet and understand the process. And then I was kind of leading projects with him in support. So it kind of flipped the dynamic, and then over time I was then leading projects myself. So it was really in a kind of a master student kind of apprenticeship type approach, which I think for something like development and in any industry really is a great way to learn, and I was very grateful and fortunate to have that kind of opportunity. So I feel, as I say, I've managed to absorb a huge amount of kind of learnings through osmosis and kind of wisdom from people in the industry that I then took on to my own projects as a development director. And then latterly, before I left, I was, for the last 3 or 4 years, I was formerly kind of design director, which meant, as well as running developments as development director, I had a slightly more broader role of as you mentioned, kind of managing relationships with architects and design team members, and then looking across projects internally, to give a view on design and other aspects whilst still running my own development projects.
Development is a career or a skill set that rewards time in the seat. It's not something you can acquire straight away. For someone who doesn't know that much about development, can you just break down the different aspects of the development process?
Yeah.
And can you give me your opinion on which part of that process you enjoy? Because some people prefer the front end, some people prefer the delivery aspect. You just kind of share a bit of light on that.
Yeah, so I think as I say, the developer a good developer should be the jack of all trades. So they need to have enough knowledge of the full process, and that full process really does start very early on. So there are different models of development. You have kind of a vertically integrated model of development, which is typically like a house builder is a good example of that, where they control everything from buying the land. Typically, they'll then bank the land. They'll then run the design process. They'll then build it out, typically via their own direct supply chain, and then they'll sell and maybe have an aftercare facility. So it's a proper kind of end-to-end integrated process. So that's the kind of at one end of the scale. And then at the other end of the scale, you have companies like Stanhope, like Grow Places, which is more of a kind of modulated approach to development. So what I mean by that is it's a skill set which works with external parties. So you offer a service to a landowner, to a fund. Maybe they already own the building and don't know what to do with it, or maybe they are looking to acquire additional assets, and you fit in as a partner. So it's very much a kind of partnership approach. So you sit alongside that investor or landowner, and in some cases they may want to be quite involved. So they may want to be kind of quite an active part of the client team. In other cases, they may want to be totally silent and totally remote. So the developer, from the professional team's perspective, i.e. the agents, the architects, the engineers, sometimes it may look like almost like a partnership where there's two entities as client. Sometimes it may look like only the development manager is the client, whereas actually behind the scenes someone else is the money. But that's a very flexible and good way of working. And then that process runs all the way through from optioneering, so working out fundamentally, A, is this a development project? B, what's the right mix of uses that's going to maximize value? And that definition of value now has to be very broad. It's not just commercial value, social value. It's a much broader assessment of value, through to assembling the right team to go and deliver that, writing the brief, making the appointments, managing the risks through the planning process to crystallize the value, and then that tending to be, broadly speaking, known as kind of pre-development. And then you get beyond that, and maybe there's a separate business plan that takes you through procurement, through development, and advising on the right procurement strategy to manage risk, the right contractor partners to come in. And then beyond PC, then either working with or sometimes internalizing an operations and management function to deal with the operational asset. And so it's kind of, as I say, it's a modulated approach. You can kind of turn one or other of those services off depending on what the client wants or what the project needs. And through that, I think it's a really flexible, really valuable service that relies very much, as you say, on knowledge, on track record, on relationships, but also and particularly, I think at the moment, in a market and a world that is so in flux, there's so much opportunity, but there's a lot of risk in the world at the moment. Changes to how people work, how people live, etc. So having a position, being quite forward-looking, being able to advise on local dynamics, but also macro trends that are affecting society, and plot a course through that for an investor, so that fundamentally their objectives are met. And as you say, if you're the landowner or you're a fund or an investor, broadly speaking, you have two primary objectives. One is that your asset is worth more, or the value is at least maintained. And two is that it hits kind of your other broader objectives. So for a lot of funds, impact funds or other general property funds, environmental, social governance, performance is so important to that as well. Hence the kind of the global term of value. So I think it's a really, really valuable position. And if you ask any architects or designers, how do you go about getting the best project? They will always say that it relies on the client. So if you could have the best design team in the world with the best vision, but if you've got a poor client, it won't be the best project it can be. And vice versa, you could have a very good client and not a very good team. So it's a collaborative process. It's a relationship driven process that hopefully, if you get that right, leads to long-term value, leads to better outcomes for the asset owners, but also for the places and the local communities in which you're building.
There's a hell of a lot of different spinning plates, as you kind of alluded to. From a skill set perspective, in your opinion, like what makes a great developer, and what skills and attributes do they need to become a world-class developer?
Yeah. So I think the number one is, and it's a cliche, but it's true, it's a people business. So I do think human skills are really important, and that goes for anything that anyone listening to this is looking to do now or in the future. Working on your leadership, your empathy, your ability to listen, your ability to have a perspective on life, but also be open-minded enough to listen to others and to learn from that. So I think there's that kind of human aspect about just being a good person with good values and imparting that onto a team. There are many different roles within the development process, but if you're talking about a development director, i.e. a project lead, you do have to be able to lead and you have to be able to take decisions. So informed decisions, as I say, but you do then have to be able to take decisions and have the ability to kind of look forward and plan and kind of project whilst remaining flexible to changing dynamics. But there are many other roles within development that, if maybe that doesn't sound like there are much more kind of analytical roles, analysts coming from a very financial background to dealing with very complicated financial models or kind of much more experiential kind of hospitality-led roles where you're coming much more from a kind of customer experience perspective, which is becoming more and more important rather than just simply a kind of process and perspective. So yeah, I think it's a very broad role, but being people-focused, I think, is really important.
You spoke about Stanhope being through a few different iterations of the business. Cadillac Fairview took a stake in the top co, and I know that they're going to be looking to kind of expand that business further. What was it that prompted you to want to leave Stanhope at the time, and why did you want to set up your own business? I guess sounds like there's a bit of a theme of control, or being an architect, giving over the control or not having the oversight or ultimate decisions. It sounds like you're kind of moving up that chain of command or control or ability to kind of influence. But what was the main reason why you left that amazing business with a great role, doing some phenomenal projects and probably rewarded really well, to take a massive risk in setting up your own business?
Well, look, as I say, I'm not at Stanhope anymore, so I can't really talk too much about the business in that respect, but I'm, as I say, very grateful for the time I've had there. And I am ambitious, so I'm as I've already said, I'm quite kind of, I've got my own values, I've got my own direction that I kind of want to take my life in, and I was there for 10 years and I've always had the itch to scratch to try and do something of my own. So I think, that on a professional side of things was the main reasons for me branching out. As I say, I've always wanted to do it. It's not an easy decision to make. I've got a young daughter, so you're a young parent as well, and that does put a different spin on things and a different perspective on life. So yeah, it wasn't really one thing. As I say, I'm very grateful for the time there. That's a great business, and they've got an amazing pipeline and a really, really strong projects kind of coming through. But yeah, as I say, if it wasn't now, I think it would have been at some point, because I've always had that itch to scratch.
Talk to me about Grow Places. Can we start off with the brand and the name? Like, how did you come to that?
Yeah. So the concept behind the name, which hopefully it kind of is slightly emotive name. I think growth brings a lot to mind, and it's a very human, it's a very natural, very organic way of talking about a process that happens in cities, but it also happens, in every aspect of life. It's a regenerative process of growth and of change, but one that's about evolution rather than revolution. And I think, that kind of is something which I've always kind of had in me. And I think it actually goes back to kind of my architectural training, the type of training I had there, which was about looking at what is found. There's an architectural movement called the As Found, which is about, you almost in a slightly like archaeological way, you actually look at places, you look at what's there, you look at the strengths and weaknesses of not only the physical place, but also the people who are there, and then you try to respond accordingly, and you use those parameters to enrich the design, to enrich the development process. So that's a big aspect of this for me, and I'm promoting this idea of place growth rather than place making. Place making as a term is very well used in the industry, and there's lots of really great examples of the work that goes on around that. But I do think there's a slight nuance on that, which is the idea of place growth, which, as I say, isn't so much this idea of kind of this sort of stamping of making a place, that it's something more transient than that. And a place has a life before the project, and it has a life after the project, and the project is a point on that growth, that evolution journey. So that's the kind of ethos behind the name and behind the brand. And also I'm very conscious that a lot of the best brands, you kind of get them. So I think people understand Grow Places. Oh, it's a development company. I kind of get that. So it's kind of a one-liner, but it's also quite deep, or at least I think it is.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. And
Yeah.
I also think, the way that it's been branded up as well, in terms of like that creative design element, that definitely feeds into it. I definitely get a sense you're creating a brand, not just a business, or it's like an ethos or a way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's right. And I know, as you are too, we actually connected, and this me being on this podcast is testament to us both taking action, setting up a podcast and promoting that, and so that's how we connected, isn't it? Is via that. So I think yes, a brand I think is really important. I think particularly moving forward. For your own purpose, for your own sense of meaning, I think having something that feels authentic to your own values is really important. And obviously this does feel like me because I've obviously created it, so to speak. But also, as and when the business grows, as you'll know from working with talent, it's really, really important that people feel like there is a brand, there is a set of values, there is a purpose to kind of what's going on. The difficult bit is then trying to actually make sure your actions align with your messaging, and that's obviously I'm on the start of that journey, and that's something I'll have to kind of continue to kind of monitor. But yeah, the idea that this is a brand, and I'm very grateful. So the concept for the brand and for the website, the feel and everything was something that sort of came from me, but I was supported, and the logo was by Dian & Co, who I've done a lot of work with over the past. They're a fantastic branding agency, and I'm very grateful for them for coming up with the soft, slightly sort of human sort of take on the brand, which I'm really, really happy with. And yeah, it's great that you think there's a kind of positive brand there too.
Yeah, I look across like the landscape, and I'm really encouraged about the future of development and investment. There seems to be quite a few people who've left some of the larger shops or mid-sized shops and who are setting up businesses where like impact, sustainability, values is right at the crux of the value proposition, and it's like deeply enrooted in the DNA of the business. And I'm really excited to support, see, enable, do a little small thing that we can do, hopefully in enabling some of the growth there. Can you just expand on what those values are of Grow Places, and then talk to me maybe about the business model and how you envisage that evolving?
Yeah, sure. So I've kind of summarized the values into 3 core values. One being impact, and that for me, you can talk about ESG in a slightly abstract way, but if you boil that down, what we're really talking about is planetary health, societal health, and personal health. So I view it in those 3 categories, and if we can think about it in terms of health, it's a much more human way to think about things as opposed to an overly quantitative way of describing some of these processes. Don't get me wrong, measuring and reporting is really, really important, but I think these themes are more than only an impact report that you kind of see. It's sort of something slightly more tangible than that. So trying to measure and report, but also to talk about things in a slightly human way. So that's the impact pillar. Creativity. So obviously, as I've expressed, my background is design, and I tend to approach problems that are found in the built environment through a design lens. So trying to promote design excellence, working with the best people that I can work with to enrich the process, but also innovation and trying to do things better, trying to do things differently, and push that idea through research, through action. And then the third pillar is the future. So I as a person, and my wife will attest to this not always being a strength, but I project forward quite a lot. I just naturally do it, and I find it stimulating to talk about and hypothesize about the future. And sometimes I have to do a lot of work to remain more present, which for my own well-being and also for my relationships is good. But projecting forward, I think in what I do, as I described, is a really good and valuable trait. And so trying to be propositional about the future, ideally look at new models, new locations, and take a slightly longer term view on things. And particularly as I mentioned, being a young company, I think it's quite a good position to have to be kind of future facing and as you mentioned, I think just generationally, people naturally do that. When there's a new generation of companies come forward, they tend to approach things in a slightly different way. But also, as I said, there's so much uncertainty, there's so much change, and therefore there's so much opportunity in the world at the moment. I think to be resilient, you really have to be future facing. I think looking backwards is useful for context, but you can't really rely on looking backwards at the moment. I think you need to be quite forward looking, and there's going to have to be some big decisions made about real assets and the uses of them, the need for them, and then therefore the kind of commercial viability of the next generation of their life. And that goes from the kind of the physical constraints of developing through to operational aspects about business models, about leasing structures, different models. So trying to be quite fluid, but I'm very conscious. In a way, it's quite easy for me to sit here and say all of this. I've thought about it a lot, and I do really believe in what I'm saying. But proof is in the pudding, and it will come through action. And so, yes, I've got a very strong starting position, but I just need to make sure that myself and Grow Places as an entity kind of lives up to what we're saying, so that it has some depth to it over time.
Yeah, I guess the challenge with building a business is business isn't you, and you aren't the business, but it's imparting those values on the business.
Yeah.
and making sure that the partners and the stakeholders and the individuals that you bring into the business embody those values and drive it forward. Can you talk to me about the business model? Because you're a property developer and a development manager, and there's distinguishing elements to both of those parts.
Yeah. So as I said, development is a process. It's a very complicated process, and because of that, there are lots of entities out there who require a service to help manage that, from a professional entity who their day job is development. It's what they live and breathe. It's their passion, and sitting alongside someone who's already got their own interests, i.e. as a development manager, you provide that service to people. So crudely speaking, a development management role is one where someone else has the money and you're the expertise, and then there's the skills. Now there are nuances on that, but keep it simple. That's the case.
And it's on a fee basis.
Typically it's a fee basis, maybe with some kind of promotes or milestone payments if you secure planning, or but essentially it's a fee-based relationship with a client entity. A development model is typically where there's some skin in the game in some form. That could be sweat equity, so putting some of your time in for an equity share or a profit share, or it could be actual capital investment, either as an alignment capital of say 10% of the cost, or as a more of a joint venture relationship where there's a kind of a more equitable, maybe 50-50 or something between entities to be more of a developer. So don't really like the term, but kind of downstream from that, i.e. within the professional industry, you might not know, and it won't necessarily feel any different, as I've said, that it may well be that Grow Places or Stanhope as an example, or others will still appear and feel like the client, but some of this is happening behind the scenes,
and the money is pulling
between the investor and between the development entity. So like any business, cash flow is king, isn't it? So you live and die on your cash flow. And what's the saying? Turnover is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash flow is king.
Yeah.
So steady income streams, whether you're a development company looking to secure development management fees, or maybe asset management fees, or you're an investment manager looking to secure investment management fees. There's these kind of principles kind of quite consistent. So looking to work with partners who are aligned with your values, and I think that's really important. For any business, particularly in a real estate project where you're minimum 3 years, but you're probably 5 to 8 years project cycle, you're going to be spending a lot of time with people you're working with. So trying to be selective about those relationships, trying to ensure that you've got shared interests, shared values, and then approaching every project, whether you've got skin in the game, so to speak, or not, in the same way, and about trying to do the best for the project and for the places that you're creating, really.
Can you tell me about the types of asset classes, the types of developments that you're going to be focused on?
Yeah, so my skill set is broad. So I've worked on large scale commercial new build refurbishments, so upwards of 500,000 feet up to sort of 1 million square feet, mixed use places, large master plans of 1,000 homes plus up to kind of 25 hectares in size. But also cultural, charitable projects is a big interest of mine. As I said, when I started in architecture, I worked for an architect who worked on cultural projects. Then one of the main reasons I really had a desire to go to Stanhope was their involvement in projects like the Royal Opera House, Tate Modern, Photographers Gallery, alongside the more commercial projects. So for me, kind of residential, commercial, but also charitable and cultural projects. So, and I think there's a real value that can be added. So the way that I'm approaching, at the moment at least, the model for Grow Places is, instead of it being kind of a product-led business model. So, for example, of that would be someone like The Collective, which was like, okay, we're going to solve one problem for a specific group of people, and it's going to result in a product which is, co-living, which is a fantastic product. But that's kind of what they do. Whereas I'm approaching it more as development is a skill set. It's a way of thinking about the world. It's a way of approaching problems, and you can apply that skill set to different use classes. And it's about relationships. It's about working with partners. It's about working with clients. And as I say, I think particularly in the world at the moment. So I'll give you an example. So if you've got an office asset that's in central London at the moment, you should, and probably are, looking at, well, should that stay as an office asset? Should it be a mixed use? Could it convert to other things? So uses are becoming more fluid. And use classes are becoming more fluid. You'll only know that from going to places, like the Hoxton or, a hotel, something like that, where you've got people co-working downstairs, you've got people eating, you've got drinking, you've got rooms upstairs. Uses are much more fluid. And so I think that approach of being more of a skill set and a way of approaching problems is really valuable. So that's how I'm trying to approach things and see where we go from there.
And knowing who to appoint on which project to be able to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, picking the right teams and ensuring that you maximise value, minimise risk in all of its senses. That's the high level position, really. And that does rely on working with, best people in the industry, really.
Talk to me about the foundation, because I know you set the business up, you also set the foundation and the podcast at the same time.
Yeah.
Talk to me about the foundation first, and then let's talk about the podcast.
So the foundation, I set up the Stanhope Foundation while I was there, and that foundation had a mission to help people find hope and pride through meaningful employment. So it was related to Stanhope's primary business, which was about delivering employment space and jobs, but it was also picking up on this social issue of employment, which is a broad social issue. Obviously, if you haven't got a job, you struggle with housing, you struggle with food and there's those very basic human needs. But then also bigger picture stuff like, AI and machine learning and replacement of traditional roles means that employment as a social theme is really broad. So that's what we pinned the foundation to, and it was set up as a separate kind of entity to Stanhope's core business with a purpose of delivering on that mission statement. So we partnered with various charity partners, and so for example, St Mungo's homeless charity, and you might think on the face of it, well, why is an employment focused entity focusing on homelessness? But obviously a big part of what homeless charities do is that kind of first line of defence to get people off the streets. But then once they're off the streets, it's then almost everything that goes around that. So helping them with self-esteem, helping them with skills, helping them with training, helping them with employment to get into, so that they have the best chance of staying off the streets that they can. So we focused our energy there on something called the Recovery College at St Mungo's, which was a specific element of their operation that was all about training. So it was a targeted approach with those charities. And then the main principle behind it was, in a positive way, leveraging the amazing network that Stanhope's built up over 35 years of consultants, contractors, agents, as I mentioned, and offering this as a platform and a way for them to engage with those charities. So the Stanhope Foundation raised over £1 million in the first 2 years while I was there, and some of that was Stanhope's money put into it, but the majority of it was from a select group of partners who supported the foundation, and they got a lot out of it as well. So there was kind of annual reports, there was monthly newsletters that our foundation team internally, and I had sort of 3 people on the foundation team working on it with me, so they got value out of it as well. And then we ran a series of events, from golf days to fitness events to present wrapping at Christmas, which was a way of uniting and bringing people together. So it became a community as well. So people would meet up for Stanhope Foundation events, and you'd have very senior people, very busy people from these companies alongside people from various levels of the company. So it became almost like a networking space as well. And yeah, so it's still there, still going strong. And if I'm honest, now that the Grow Foundation, which is, you know, my version of that, will hopefully be a similar thing. Now, obviously, it will be appropriate to the scale of where I am, but the ideas and the concepts behind it will be similar. Hopefully, it will grow with the business, and particularly will transition into helping very specifically on local issues around the developments where we're operating. So what I described at Stanhope Foundation was almost like the corporate element of it, so business to business. But there's a real opportunity for it to be something which is an on-the-ground presence around the developments in which we're operating, engaging with local people and engaging with specific local social needs or charities who are operating locally. So it can kind of have two levevels to it.
Amazing. It has that impact piece right at the heart of the business and the values.
Yeah, exactly that. And then you mentioned the foundation, the podcast. So the idea behind the podcast, which is called People Grow Places, so it's exploring the virtuous circle between people, growth and place. So this idea that people grow places and places grow people, and it's kind of reinforcing one another. And it's a way for, in the same way you're doing here, Matt, you know, to have a really, really open conversation, one-to-one, to try to understand the person and try to understand what drives them and motivates them to do what they do. So we've had a range of people on the podcast already, architects, people from third sector, and over time I want that to grow. So kind of horizontally within the industry, it will hopefully give a good cross section of the different people and what they do and what drives them, to help connect people within the industry and create that network. But also almost like vertically, if you imagine it, between the industry and the projects and the local people. So again, it's nothing more than a vision at this point in time, but I'd love to be able to, alongside the Grow Foundation, have People Grow Places as maybe a way to give voice through consultation processes with local people. So maybe you'll go and interview the shopkeeper who's next to the development to ask him about what he thinks about the development, and he'll have a very different viewpoint from
the money behind it.
The money and the aspirations of the design team. He'll be much more worried about much more local issues, and trying to use it as a platform to do that. And you know, I think the whole consultation side of development is a very difficult balance to strike, because on one side you've got mitigating risk and trying to manage your way through a planning process to secure a planning permission. That's the ultimate objective of the investor. But there is much more nuance around how communities are engaged, how communities feel part of the process, and there can be some real richness and value that can come from engaging with local people. But the reality is it also can potentially increase the risk from the investor's perspective. You've got to kind of stick your head above the parapet a little bit. You kind of, you've got to kind of become a person as opposed to just an entity that's, the applicant. And, as I say, there's risks and reward that go with that, and it has to be kind of done in a careful way. And I haven't got the answers for this. As I say, I'm just starting on that journey a little bit, but trying to through these kind of three mechanisms: Grow Places as the company, Grow Foundation as the charity entity, and then the People Grow Places podcast, use those three vehicles as a way to kind of bridge some of these gaps.
2023 has been an interesting year so far. As we cast our eyes forward, what are you most excited about, and where do you see the biggest opportunity in the market at the moment?
Yeah, so I think there's a huge amount of opportunity. So I think, obviously, tackling the climate emergency and trying to reduce carbon in what we do, trying to reuse buildings in really innovative ways that actually create more interesting products as well. So not just the idea that if you're reusing a building, it becomes a secondary asset. I think there's going to be a value swing actually between a really best-in-class reuse project versus a new project. I think, the investment piece, that there's going to be a shift in value there, and that you've kind of already seen that in terms of occupier demand on the commercial side. So I think the opportunity to reuse and to innovate and to push different ways of looking at development, different materials, but all still through a kind of, at least in my mind, through a growth mindset approach of densifying cities, of densifying urban areas. I think that's a really good opportunity. As I say, we've already touched on the fact that with this uncertainty comes a lot of opportunity to do things slightly differently and to be a kind of first mover, or at least be towards the front of the curve on that. So whether that is change of use, I think is really interesting from office to something else, whether that's to hotel, to more of a kind of co-work mixed use building, or whether that's to residential. You know, there was a building in the press recently around Barbican that Hub Residential have just purchased, existing commercial asset that they've purchased to convert to residential. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that type of thing, as well as obviously best in class commercial. So yeah, I think in urban areas there's a massive amount of opportunity. One area that I'm personally interested in is trying to make development more affordable, which is obviously very difficult at the moment given where things are, construction prices and just the economy generally. But innovative models around ownership, ideas around ownership, around stakes in assets, to try and create something that's more equitable in terms of the model, I think is really interesting.
A question that I ask everyone as we draw to a close here, Tom, who comes on the podcast, is if I was to give you £500 million of equity, who are the people, what property, in which place would you look to deploy that? You might have just touched on that in the answer you've just given, but are you able to boil it down to the people, property and place you would look to deploy that capital?
So the people, I would look to create a kind of a case and a kind of a customer avatar, if you will, around everyday people looking to live somewhere in a very basic sense. So housing, for me, mid-market housing that's it isn't kind of captured by the affordable housing quota that local authorities or partners deliver, but is for kind of everyday people, maybe young families who are kind of working people but need somewhere to live that's close to schools, close to amenities, that improves quality of life. So that would be the brief that I would look at, and I'm actually quite interested in evolving that theme. The other people involved in that is obviously investors, impact funds, people are looking to kind of maybe take a slightly longer term view on investment, but actually make a real positive social impact. So that would be it. And then in terms of the places, I think there's a real opportunity for that in outer London boroughs, but also commutable locations and secondary, tertiary cities that are walkable neighbourhoods. So places that have access to a train station and to a high street within 15 minutes, so that you can have a walkable, more sustainable lifestyle, but also the ability to move about, maybe to a large urban centre like London. So that would be what I'd do with it.
Amazing. Well, look, Tom, I've loved hearing a little bit more about your background, your views, opinions, the values, where impact fits into like the core and the heart of your business. I know we're only a couple of months into the journey, and I get a real sense that I know a lot of it has been in your head for a while, but you've thought long and hard about it. Yeah. But actually bringing this to life gives you great joy. You're clearly very capable and very good at it. And I'm really excited to see how it evolves, and then the wider impact that you have within the real estate space and for the people right at the heart of what you're doing for Grow Places. So thanks for joining me on the podcast today. And like I said, excited to see what you go on to do.
No, Matt, thanks very much for having me, and thanks for everything you're doing. This is fantastic.
Cheers. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the People, Property, Place podcast. If you found it insightful, feel free to share it with a friend or colleague, subscribe, give us a rating, like or comment. It helps tremendously. It'd be great to hear from you on LinkedIn. I'm super open-minded to recommendations of which guests you think we should get on the podcast or areas of the market that we should explore further. So do drop me a message. The People, Property, Place podcast is powered by Rockborn. The team recruit experienced talent for real estate private equity firms, investment managers, REITs, property companies and advisory firms across the investment, asset management, development, fund management, ESG, cap markets, investor relations and general practice space. So if you're considering your career options at the moment or looking to attract top talent to come and work for you, head over to the website www.rockborn.com, where you can find a wealth of resource to aid your search. Have a great day wherever you are, and I look forward to catching you next time.